we do have our reading group at JLI at a slightly different time this week, which I suspect might be what's confusing people. But we're very happy to have Dr. Nalika Gajaweera and Andrea Paris here to speak about Nalika's work. We, as you can just tell, we've started recording, so just the usual housekeeping that if you don't want to be represented on the recording, just let us know on the chat and we can ask questions on your behalf, etc. at the end of the question and answers. So the reading group sessions, we have a usual format, which we'll be sticking with today as well. So we'll have about 20 to 25 minutes for Nalika's presentation. And then we will also have a response from Andrea. It'll be about 10 minutes, and then hopefully a good 15 to 20 minutes towards the end for question and answers. We'll do, as a smaller group, we'll just do question and answers by unmuting, or as I said, you can type your questions to us in the chat. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Nalika and for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Thanks, Rima. Thanks, Andrea, and all the other organizers and chairs of JLI Initiative for inviting me and for organizing this reading group. I'm honored by the invitation, and I'm excited to kind of to share this work with the community, with the reading group community. The brief presentation I'll be giving today is based on a recently published article called "The Mothers of the Righteous Society: Lay Buddhist Women as Agents of the Sinhala Buddhist Nationalist Imaginary," that came out in a special focus issue end of last year in the Journal of Global Buddhism, and it was the special issue was entitled "Bad Buddhisms." The contribution of the contributors, the special editors, the special issue editors, and the contributors of this issue on bad Buddhism were especially concerned about confronting particularly normative assumptions found in both popular culture, but also sometimes in the scholarly discourse within the academy, on Buddhism as inherently good or moral, and therefore positing certain regions, communities, in community groups as somehow deviant or lacking and relegated to bad Buddhism or bad Buddhists. So it was this kind of conceptual, it was this kind of challenge that the special issue overall was seeking to address. And it's a breadth of different scholars talking on this issue as well. So my point of reference to this issue of bad Buddhism was based on my ethnographic research between 2009, 2010, which formed part of my dissertation project with Sri Lankan NGOs. And in this particular project, with this particular article that I'm sharing, was based on research with a Sri Lankan NGO that was formed predominantly by female leadership. It wasn't a women's NGO, but it was carried out and run mostly by women who were actively invested through their NGO efforts in advancing a nationalist agenda. The overall dissertation project examined how Buddhist notions of giving and generosity shaped and enacted the way Buddhist actors in the local NGOs in Sri Lanka engaged in humanitarian work. So doing this work, field work in 2009 and 2010, now a long time ago, it was really in the context of the post-tsunami, but also the end of the Civil War that my research was happening. Some of these enactments by NGOs were by Buddhist actors within NGOs. So they were also not Buddhist NGOs necessarily. This one was, but the NGOs that I was documenting and doing fieldwork were not Buddhist NGOs necessarily. But some of these NGOs are enacted what I call more cosmopolitan Buddhist ethics. I've written about this before. But this piece is based upon research with the organization that really advanced and enacted a more nationalistic ethno-religious ends, kind of mission that they had. In my fieldwork with this latter group, particularly NGOs involving significant investment by Sinhalese Buddhist women in terms of their volunteer labor and charity, inspired my own interest and curiosity in understanding the gender dimensions of faith-based humanitarianism. That is, to focus on how gender dynamics and situatedness of those gender dynamics in local power relations shaped humanitarianism and charitable efforts. I'd like to share, first of all, a little bit about the methodology. And in a sense, this presentation is going to be kind of informed and inspired by talking about the methodology and my own positionality in this research. Doing this fieldwork with these women and figuring out how to make sense of and frame their charitable engagements was really personally quite disquieting experience. I found, as a Sinhalese Buddhist woman myself, who had grown up in Sri Lanka amidst civil war and was intimately familiar with the politics of Sinhalese Buddhist ethno-religious majoritarianism and its impacts on minority groups and populations. That this fieldwork with these women and the NGOs they founded and operated was unsettling. They and their political alliances were actively engaged at the time in promoting particularly militant forms of patriarchal Buddhist nationalism activism. And through the religiously inflected charitable giving. A further dimension that I did not elaborate in this paper was the close nexus that these female organizers had between themselves and the Sri Lankan army, with the military often providing significant resources such as transport, food, and accommodation for the NGO to carry out its work. So at the same time, doing this field, because I'm able to draw on this privileged identity marker in Sri Lanka as a Sinhalese Buddhist woman myself, to be given access to the programs and the work that they were doing. This became immediately apparent to me on my first day of fieldwork with this group. And I was talking to Dr. Anula Vijayasundara, who I quote in this article, and she posed the question to me, are you Buddhist? Are you Sinhalese Buddhist? And I was raised in a Buddhist household. That was how I was able to kind of approach this and be truthful and honest. But at the same time, there was a question. There's a coded question. Was like, where are your kind of stakes and what's your politics? So I kind of sidestepped that question, the kind of the oblique question that she was asking by saying that. But I wanted to kind of like. In retrospect, writing this article, I was like, this is the kind of conversation, a reading group kind of space that I can actually also talk about my own positionality in the project. So at the same time, I was also cognizant that these women were highly educated and received notable respect and recognition for their professional accomplishments as women in Sinhalese society and their various professional networks. Of course, like talking to family friends about that I'm doing this research with this organization who's run by these women. It was in social circles in Colombo. It was like, okay, this is a very recognized women and their accomplishments are very well known in society. So they were doctors, school teachers, nurses, and scholars as well. At the same time, they were drawing on these privileges and authority to play a pivotal role to sustain a militant, hegemonic Sinhala Buddhist imaginary in Sri Lanka. So in my efforts to make sense of their efforts and engagement through civic activism that promoted nationalist goals, I found little recourse in the academic scholarship at the time in the field of humanitarianism and development, the anthropology of faith, faith-based giving, or Buddhist studies to capture the nuances and complexities of their engagement as Buddhist women. Indeed, they were the quintessential bad Buddhist, promoting illiberal nativistic goals, hampering the nativistic growth, hampering the progress toward the telos of Buddhist modernity. So for example, in the field of humanitarianism and development, and I don't mean to like caricature it here, but like, the issue of faith-based giving often falls within the dominant secular religious debate. In the context of such a debate, religious giving's gendered dimension or the gendered dimension of NGO work is relatively understudied, especially in the non-Christian context. Moreover, when attention is brought to the area, the interest in religious women's activism is limited to those aligned with liberal concerns and preoccupations. namely the role of women in challenging traditional patriarchy, against fighting for gender-based violence, issues of human trafficking and such. And the issue of gender broadly around issues of gender equality and liberal democratic goals. There is some work, and I've cited some of this research, on women, like the Shiva Sena women in India and their activism in Hindu nationalist projects. But it is difficult to find a lot of this. So in a sense, there's a parallel in studies about female beneficiaries as well. Dr. Elizabeth LaRue, I hope I pronounced her last name correct. She presented a few months ago, also suggesting earlier that there is work that gives precedence to women beneficiaries who advocate a liberal agenda, while those who don't fit neatly into such normative expectations are deemed kind of problematic, or is kind of like glossed over and really not focused upon. This I found also the case in understanding women humanitarian benefactors. Religious lay women's generosity and charity tend to often be framed as a form of popular religion and tradition, with little attention given to its importance in contemporary economics, politics, and power. In the field of Buddhist studies, where Buddhist women's civic activism is often studied through the theoretical framework of Buddhist modernism, this privileging of a certain category of women who promote liberal feminist ideals of agency also prevails. I found that in the field of Buddhist modernism, the most notable preoccupation around women and Buddhism was with female Buddhist renunciants. As Nirmala Salgado argued in her work, Gendered, now I'm trying to recall the exact title of it, Buddhist Nuns and Gendered Practice. These lives, the lives of female renunciants, Buddhist renunciants, are often understood through liberal feminist ideals of agency, where autonomy and freedom vis-a-vis traditional patriarchy and power is the mainstay, where women's agency is evaluated in terms of their capacity for transcending and resisting patriarchy and asserting their self-autonomy. So in the scholarship, I found again that there was little in the way of offering what I call, drawing on the work of Sri Lankan scholar Harshana Rambukwala, a critical yet empathetic look at the lives and goals of women who did not fit the normative liberal mode. That is just how to pay closer attention to what religious women actually do in relation to the conditions in which they live, exploring the kinds of conditions, possibilities those conditions allow. So as I already noted, the goals that these women aspire to cannot be well accounted through the liberal feminist framework, in which agency is evaluated in terms of their capacity for transcending and resisting patriarchy and asserting self-autonomy. So I know that Dr. Elizabeth LaRue's work kind of supports, the kind of argument I'm making. And so this is not a new kind of critique that I'm bringing. So I'm building on this kind of existing kind of challenge that's kind of happening right now. So in order to do this in the field work that I did, it actually took me, I wrote my dissertation and this piece came out in 2020. So it took me a good 10 years to actually, be able to figure out how to kind of document this, to kind of make sense of this. And the publication of the call for abstracts for this special issue on bad Buddhism really spoke to me, because it's like, this is the home for this project, for this piece, because I can kind of really kind of problematize the idea of bad Buddhism at the same time as look in the face of a very challenging kind of problematic, that kind of goes against our own kind of politics or feminist politics, and my own personal politics as a Sri Lankan, and in which these NGOs were actually advocating a program that is very problematic and very toxic. But at the same time, how do we talk about these women's work? So this was kind of like the challenge I had, and this article is kind of an expression of how I try to make sense of this. So in order to do this, I found myself having to step momentarily away from the existing scholarship on religion and development and women and Buddhism, and instead situate these women's actions against a historical record. What emerged was a genealogy of the Theravada Buddhist women's religious giving, from the medieval times through the colonial modern period to contemporary post-colonial context, that reveals how ideas of motherhood, moral virtue, and bourgeois notions of respectability dovetail with one another today to inform various social political ideals of femininity for lay Sinhalese Buddhist women today, and how it informs the ways in which their power is negotiated and presented in contemporary society. So to quickly summarize this genealogy, I first looked at the role that Theravada ideals about giving and generosity, especially around notions of cultivating moral virtue, have historically played in framing ideals of femininity for lay Buddhist women. It was really exciting to kind of go back to go to the scholarship on medieval and pre-medieval kind of literature to look at these connections, to see this genealogy and this connection of femininity and motherhood and how it's related to gift giving and dana and these kind of very local vernacular concepts and to see how these kind of things kind of continue, the genealogy continues through these women's work. At the same time, I explored how, so in that work, what was really interesting to me is how women's religious giving to the Sangha, to the monastic or the Theravada community or the Theravada tradition, is envisioned as an extension of their domestic and maternal responsibilities. I then turned to look at how Sri Lanka's experience of colonial modernity added a further dimension to women's responsibilities as mothers of the nation vis-a-vis her guardianship of the Buddhist heritage as national culture. Here I found post-colonial scholarship incredibly helpful, as well as feminist scholarship of South Asian scholars. To unpack not only how Sinhalese femininity got formed in relation to nationalist agendas, but also how these ideas of maternal responsibility shaped women's roles in the area of social welfare and social development work, particularly in the rural countryside among poor Sinhalese communities. The poor Sinhalese communities got constituted in colonial modernity as a location of culture that requires preservation and protection from outside foreign threats. It is in that kind of context that Sinhalese women became the kind of guardians, the kind of the moral bastions of the nation in terms of their, especially the elite middle class, upper middle class educated Sinhala women who are being educated in Buddhist girls' schools, which I did primary schooling as well with, in which they're being kind of the subjectivity is in relation to their power and their own positionality in society is in relation to preserving the culture, the heritage of Sri Lanka, vis-a-vis beneficiaries who are seen as the Sinhalese Buddhist poor, who are the kind of the vulnerable spots of the national heritage. And so vis-a-vis their own kind of vis-a-vis these beneficiaries, these women were elite women, middle class, urban women are constituted in their own subjectivities as well. So in the context of colonial modernity in Sri Lanka, Sinhalese Buddhist class lay Buddhist women enacted their own privileged place in bourgeois society by shoring up culturally prescribed notions of motherhood for the purpose of elite nationalist aspirations to realize a righteous society, dharmishtika samaja. This is a concept that kind of circulates within the subcontinent and South Asia, but you see this emerge over and over again during the colonial period and the post-colonial independence era as well. Today, you will hear it again, this idea of the righteous society in political propaganda at the same time, and it gets invoked even in the work of these NGO actors. It is against this historical backdrop that I introduce ethnographic material based on long-term fieldwork conducted in Sri Lanka with middle class and elite women who engaged in civil society. So I turned to my ethnographic record, examining how middle class women's practices of giving dana, alms giving to the Sangha, and participating in charitable activities in rural Sri Lanka as two means through which the elite women enact their agency as patrons and sustainers of a hegemonic Sinhalese Buddhist national imaginary. it helps to make sense of how they became respectable and recognized in society as well. Doing so enabled me to explore the ways in which these women, through their charitable welfare, in the service of the Sangha and rural and vis-a-vis the Sinhala poor, inhabited a recognized feminized mode of power in Buddhism. That is, as benefactresses of the Dhamma, in order to enhance their role as feminine moral guardians of the Buddhist nation. This notion of the Buddhist benefactress was something that Professor Kumari Jayawardena, a noted Sri Lankan South Asian scholar, she talks about a long time ago. I've discovered it in my dissertation fieldwork period, like writing about this in the 60s and the 70s. And when I was doing this fieldwork, I was like, these are this legacy continues through these the NGO format and framework. So what I hope at the end in this paper to achieve is that it can contribute to a more nuanced understanding of the lives of women who carry out actions that do not align with our feminist liberal understandings or what they ought to be doing and to the ought to be heading in the progressive feminist goals of emancipatory politics. Today, I work at the Center for Religion and Civic Culture. I'm a research anthropologist and this is a center based at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. And one of the projects that we have undertaken is to understand the lives of Catholic women religious around the world, in the United States, in Africa, in Mexico, and in India. And we do like projects. It's a foundation funded project. And it's part of that work is a monitoring, evaluation, learning work that we do. And I find that this kind of sensitivity that I've developed through this research with Buddhist women who do nationalist work, actually who pursue illiberal goals, actually very helpful for my current work as well. With Catholic nuns who don't really fit our kind of like framework of what women should be doing, what kinds of goals and purposes they should be like doing. They are often anti, birth control and contraceptives. They, at the same time, they have very conservative views about certain sexual ethics and politics. And at the same time, they are, very important and valuable people in their communities. They serve all the people who are excluded by the state and by other communities. And so like, they are fabulous, interesting women who are educated and intelligent. And then they also hold these kinds of other ethics and politics. And there are these ethos of, the chastity, obedience, and purity. And how do they kind of negotiate those charisms that they carry in the work that they do? And so I just wanted to share something right now, share the work that I'm doing right now and how work with Sinhalese women on this small island nation, shaping kind of my work today as well with nuns as well. And like, how do we, issues often come up in our project about how they kind of negotiate their autonomy or what autonomy means to these women has to be very particular and context sensitive, and perhaps if given enough time for me to kind of like embed that in the genealogy of Catholic women religious. So I'm going to end with that and turn it over to Andrea and then the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nalika. So Andrea, straight over to you for your response.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks for the opportunity to read this paper and engage with you today. So to provide some context to my comments, I'm going to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. So I appreciated your comments on your positionality. So in terms of my professional identity, I'm not a religious studies scholar or an anthropologist. I'm a political scientist that identifies with the subdiscipline of international relations. My own research and teaching focuses on the history, politics, and ethics of international humanitarianism. And I've pursued various projects on the role of faith-based NGOs, mostly from the perspective of Christian missionary and development organizations based in Canada. Personally, while I was raised in a pretty conservative evangelical Christian household, I considered myself agnostic through much of my 20s, and then started formally studying Tibetan Buddhism in my 30s, and would now consider myself a Buddhist practitioner. I'm also married to a Tibetan man who spent much of the first half of his life as a monk in monasteries in Tibet and India. And we have a 3-year-old daughter who, between her mother and her father, is already having to navigate her mixed Canadian and Tibetan identities. I've spent a fair bit of time with the Tibetan community in both India and Canada, and have witnessed the complexities in that context of how religious identity overlaps with cultural identity in the context of political exile. I tell you all of this because my interpretation of this article is influenced both by my scholarly work on international development and humanitarianism, and also my perspective as a white Buddhist feminist liberal with personal and familial ties to Tibetan Buddhist practices, the latter of which are also deeply connected to goals of Tibetan cultural preservation. So yes, Nalika, complexity, contradiction, which is a theme that comes out in your paper. So a lot of what went through my mind as I was reading the article were comparisons and connections to this context that I'm more familiar with. So I'm going to detour to that a bit. I was immediately reminded of the Tibetan Women's Association, which was founded by Tibetan women living in exile in India in 1984. Historically, in both pre-Chinese occupied Tibet, which was ruled by monasteries, and in exile, women were very much excluded from politics and governance. Women did not participate formally in the Tibetan government in exile in India until the 1980s. The Tibetan Women's Association provided one of the first socially acceptable platforms for women to be able to engage politically in the public sphere, and retains this status to the present day. Its website states that one of its goals is the, quote, political participation and social empowerment of women. In other words, the TWA is an important source of political agency for women in the Tibetan community. At the same time, I could see it functioning in very similar ways to the Mothers of the Righteous Society that Nalika describes in her article. In exile, the Tibetan Women's Association, and here again I quote from their website, quote, places great priority on the contributions of Tibetan women toward the preservation and promotion of the distinct religion, culture, and identity of the Tibetan people. In other words, the TWA and all Tibetan women are the guardians, the mothers of Tibetan culture, which is threatened both in Tibet and in exile. But even within the TWA's activism, it promotes a certain vision of women's agency that is tied to a specific understanding of feminine identity and domesticity. In April of just this year, the TWA elected its new executive for a 3-year term. After the meeting, the new executive issued a 9-point resolution stating its goals, which included encouraging women to have more kids to address the declining population of Tibetans in exile. The TWA has also been known to discourage mixed marriages in service of cultural preservation. So yes, agency is often complex and contradictory, and absolutely does not conform to the liberal norms one might expect of an organization committed to women's empowerment. Nalika's article also brought to my mind some of my favorite readings about the role of gender in constructing the identity of international development workers, which is an area that I do research and teaching in. Barbara Huron's book, Desire for Development, investigates what draws so many white middle-class Canadian women to international development work. She starts by tracing the historical emergence of bourgeois subjectivity in the 19th century, a subjectivity that was both white and male, and therefore not fully accessible to the women who resided within the private domestic sphere. Huron writes, and I quote here, as women struggled in the era of empire to gain a position in the public sphere, they expanded their role in areas where gender was not as strongly a prohibiting factor. That is, where middle-class women's nurturing goodness might render their involvement more acceptable and where their respectability would not be compromised. doesn't this sound pretty similar to the Buddhist lay women that Nalika describes, who are carving out their influence in a sphere that is socially acceptable? Huron then traces how there are colonial continuities to be found in the motivations of female Canadian development workers who pursue development work out of a sense of obligation and entitlement to intervene on behalf of other women in the global South. This altruism is contingent on positioning the other as available to be changed, saved, and improved, and also helps to preserve a national narrative around Canada's role as an international do-gooder. And relevant to Nalika's article, Huron's book demonstrates how these women's involvement in international development perpetuates a highly raced, classed, and gendered construction of their own identities that is also linked to the identity of the good Canadian state. Along similar lines, Nancy Cook also investigates the motivations and agency of Western female development workers, specifically in Pakistan, and similar to Nalika, shows how their agency is contradictory and complicated. Cook argues that the female development workers she encountered in Pakistan position themselves as free and independent in comparison to the so-called subjugated Muslim women they encounter. She writes, and I quote, "By imagining Gilgiti women as an oppressed mass in need of their benevolence, or at least of their superior cultural example, Western women avoid confronting their own gender oppression at home. This characterization also allows them to capitalize on racial inequalities to realize their own personal freedom." End of quote. So as Nalika writes in her conclusion, agency often enables other forms of oppression. And we see this here in these examples. So I could go on about many of the parallels I identified between my observations of the Tibetan Women's Association, my own kind of personal life experiences as a Buddhist and married to a Tibetan man, where, sometimes the function of preserving religious ritual falls to me in the personal sphere, even though I'm the white convert, so that's all very interesting. So there was a lot going on in my mind when I was reading the article. And I could go on to other links with this other scholarship. But I know we're here to discuss Nalika's article about middle-class Buddhist lay women in Sri Lanka, so I'll return to that now as I conclude. So first, I wondered what the men, women, and children who were the rural audience members of the People's Meeting made of the speeches made by these elite urban visitors. Just like I wonder what the Pakistani women made of the Western development workers who came to their towns. In Nalika's article, we don't hear from them or learn how they interpreted the message from the founders of Gajaweera. In other words, I would be interested to know more about how the women in the audience exercise their own agency. Do they buy the message that they are the mother warriors of the nation? What was their agency in relation to the middle-class urban elites who were selling this message? I also wondered in what terms the founders of the organization understood themselves. They were certainly positing a specific vision of nationhood, kind of similar to Huron's Canadian development workers. And they were resisting what they perceived as a history of colonialism and the interference of Christian NGOs. They are self-consciously resisting, but did they also self-consciously view themselves as offering an alternative, contextually specific version of feminist agency, even if Western liberal feminists would resist identifying these women as feminists? In other words, do they see themselves as feminists, even if we see them as bad feminists? More broadly, I'm also wondering about what here is specific or unique to the Buddhist Sinhalese women in Nalika's article, and that's why I appreciated your comments about where your research is going in relation to these nuns. So I'd love to hear more about that. So what can we learn from the case that you describe in your article that might be shared across these different contexts? I've found some hints about similarities in my quick comparisons with the Tibetan Women's Association and the work of Barbara Huron and Nancy Cook. It is probably safe to say that women everywhere have to navigate conflicting and competing pressures and identities. But taking these cases into comparison with each other, we can also see that efforts to do good and help others are often also implicated in relations of oppression, as Nalika concludes. There are many different versions of humanitarianism, but what they seem to have in common is that they all seem to contain this complexity and contradiction. These dynamics are not actually an aberration, but are perhaps inherent in humanitarian activities, so we should cease to be so surprised each time we encounter them. These are some of my takeaways, but I'd also be interested to hear more from Nalika about what she thinks are the broader things we can learn from her study. I'll also leave Nalika with this parting question, which is just something I'm curious about rather than skeptical. And it's something that comes up at the beginning and the end of the article. And you also talked about it in your talk, but I want to know more. You start and end the article with the proposition to bring a, quote, critical but empathetic look at the Buddhist women's participation in ethno-nationalist Sinhala Buddhist hegemony. I'm interested to hear more about the empathetic part of this approach. I get the critical side of it, and you provide a superb demonstration of this in the article. But why is empathy also required in order to be able to understand the lived agency of these women? Where does empathy get us that criticism does not? And so those are my comments. So thank you again.
Yeah, nice final point. Thank you very much, Andrea. So great. So we've had two reflections on this disconnect between the liberal, sometimes but not always, secular feminism that's demonstrated by many Western humanitarian and development workers in the gender space, and then the complexity of the political, class, religious identity of women working in nationally or diaspora faith-based organizations. I noticed that a few people have joined as we've gone on through the conversation, so I don't know necessarily if the audience has questions ready, but we are moving over into a question and answer section for the rest of the call. We have 19 minutes, so hopefully a good amount of time. So if you would like to ask a question, obviously Andrea posed some questions for Nalika, so we can go to those, but if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand to alert me that you would like to ask a question now. But I will also just leave, let's say, 10 seconds, 20 seconds of space now for you to unmute and ask your question. So over to the audience, you should be able to unmute to ask a question.
Can I answer the question about empathy in the meantime?
Yes, so everyone please keep thinking of your questions. You can put them in the chat as well. But Nalika, yes, you actually have a few questions from Andrea to answer. So please feel free to go ahead and respond to them all, actually. Yeah.
They're all really great questions, and I appreciate you bringing them up. But I'll end with the one. I'll start with the one, and maybe there are others that'll come in as well. So I'll open up for that stuff. But so I'm picking one of them, and I really like this question on why is empathy important. I'm just thinking on on my feet right now, and I think like for me it was the empathy aspect was what allowed or enabled, or was kind of what inspired me to look at the connections between dana, merit making, and women's play, like femininity. And so I know through my fieldwork, I recognized how merit making practices and dana was such an important spiritual and religious aspect for them. And so I feel that if I lack that empathetic aspect of it, so for me in the field work, it was or actually the writing of it, was kind of grounding what they're doing in the historical record and in kind of important religious giving movements and actions, that I felt I was able to kind of bring something other than just the nationalist work that they were doing, to kind of couch how is it that they were also framing this within a longer legacy of women's work within Buddhism, as kind of benefactresses and caretakers of the Sangha. So, and also that I think being empathetic is kind of a move to, I was always often thinking, I am citing these women's names in this organization as public figures. Would they be able to see themselves in this? So maybe they won't. Maybe they'd be very upset. But at the same time, the genealogy that I traced was a way of being like, this is a genealogy that you and I can recognize, and are situated within. And also, I see myself as a Sinhalese Buddhist woman being drawn into those kinds of networks, as you yourself are personally finding. And so it is that kind of personal connection in a sense, as well as being able to understand how those very intimate spiritual kind of elements are also at play here. That just a critical view may kind of gloss over. Not necessarily, but I think my idea is that that could gloss over that. And why is it that they do it, kind of thing. So it's also I'm an anthropologist. I think I didn't mention that. And so as an anthropologist, how do you represent things that represent people in ways that they might be able to see themselves in? So that's my response to that question.
Okay, any other questions from the audience?
Hi, Nalika. I really appreciated that paper. Thank you. I am looking at research that focuses on Christian humanitarian groups, and I am very new to the kind of the Buddhist realm, and particularly kind of the feminist approach that you've taken. And I really I learned a lot. So I'm really grateful. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how we can move beyond equating kind of conservative or traditionally religious women as subjugated, and in order to kind of, I'm just really interested in hearing you talk a bit more about kind of this idea of painting a picture that people recognize themselves in, that takes that notion of agency more broadly, to kind of, well, what do they see as agency here, and what are their motives and goals?
Okay. So the question is, how do we can you reframe just like
it's 2 o'clock in the morning in Australia where I currently am.
No,
so I'm not very
sorry. No, I'm so
apologize.
sorry also.
But I guess I'm just interested in hearing you talk more about kind of how we can, as scholars, we can not kind of revert to these stereotypes of religious or conservative women as kind of subjugated and oppressed, and rather kind of how do we get away from that?
I think, like, again, I would say, and I'm going to compare my research right now with Catholic nuns and this project, and the kind of flexibility and kind of luxury, in a sense, as an academic, you have to like actually spend time looking at historical kind of precedents to what we're seeing. That is one aspect that I think, like, so in my contemporary work as Mel work, monitoring, evaluation, learning, you don't really have that kind of luxury to like, step back and read the genealogy of what's happening. And that's why I said, like, it'd be great if I could do this with Catholic nuns, but I don't really have that luxury. In the kind of work that's applied work, it's not 100%, you don't have the luxury of an academic work to do that, the space to do that. But I think that I'm curious myself of like, how is it that a genealogical, so Talal Asad, anthropologist Talal Asad, he writes about genealogical work. And so I'm thinking about how is it that that kind of approach makes us sensitive to how agency moves and changes. And you could see it's shifting kind of nature in a sense in historical periods, and then seeing how different kinds of political movements, political socioeconomic kind of conditions, colonialism, post-colonialism, neoliberalism, these kinds of political economic conditions shape the ways in which women consider and view their agency. So I would say that in any context that this is happening, it would be really interesting, for example, to think about like Catholic nuns in relation, of course, to the church, but also in terms of the colonial, post-colonial project in Africa, for example, or in India. How is it that within the genealogy of like, what's her name? Nightingale, what's her first name? What do you call her? Forgetting her name.
Florence Nightingale?
Florence Nightingale, like the white woman savior who's coming to India to do this sanitation work and kind of, this kind of colonial humanitarian work. But at the same time, how do like Indian women then kind of continue, Indian sisters and Indian women continue that work, but in a post-colonial, anti-colonial kind of resistance work? And how do sisters kind of like fall within that? That would be like an example of like, just like what happens if we actually take history serious, and the history of women in a particular place seriously. What opens up? And I found that that's the approach that helped me kind of get at this actual conceptual problem that I myself was kind of hitting up against. And I appreciate you staying up till 2 a.m.
Yeah, Alana, definitely, yes. It's the context is everything point, and you have to look backwards and around rather than just making assumptions. Any other questions? I have a question, but does anyone else have a question? Charlotte, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you so much for this. It was really wonderful reading your work. I'm also new to the field. I'm a divinity student looking at development and gender. And I have a question. I'll try and get to it sort of succinctly. But I was thinking about an essay that I read a while ago by Rebecca Saul from the 90s called No Time to Worship the Serpent Deities. And it was looking at a redefinition of women's work outside of Western secular frameworks, specifically in the Sakya Buddhist spiritual domain in Nepal. And she had some sort of similar, but also different ideas about what it means for a woman's world to be homebound and how that might raise flags to Western secular feminists, but also finding that homebound means that the women were absolutely spiritual leaders, especially in the upper middle class. And she referred to this practice more as a culture bearing, and so much so that the responsibility of culture bearing, similarly to your paper, was being put on the women, that economic development brought to women who wanted to start businesses. It was actually seen as if, that would leach the cultural roles from some of these women's lives. So similar questions about what autonomy looks like outside of the Western secular framework, and if it is culture or nation building. And I guess I care less about, whether or not there's an anthropological difference, although I'm sure there is a lot between culture bearing and nation building. But I guess I'm wondering more about whether development organizations are maybe too ready to label women's actions one way or the other, especially if they're from the global South or the global North. If there's like a tendency to look towards culture bearing being, more secularly positive and nation building being more secularly negative. I don't know if I'm making an over assumption there, but. So I guess this is a question more about what you think development is labeling.
As culture versus nation building.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. I haven't thought of that, but I mean, I'm thinking about this kind of division of labor in a sense that happened during the colonial modern period, in which culture was also an important part for men, and in terms of literature, as well as in terms of like politics and things like that. And culture also, but I think it became in the family household in which the culture gets kind of retained and passed down versus culture towards the public world. So I'm thinking about, you know, so when men were writing like, you know, kind of like poetry and things like that during the modern period, it was about preserving the culture for the and this is pre-independence, so there is no nation yet, and you know, this is so I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm just kind of reflecting on this difference between culture and nation. And I get so are you seeing that development kind of sector has a negative stance towards nation? Is that one of the aspects of what you're asking about?
Yeah, and I appreciate you just reflecting, because you know more about this than I do, but I think that is my assumption reading outside of the Western feminist context, is that like nation building is this negative thing that development is pushing against, and that's part of what defines, quote unquote, the bad feminist also.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, and I mean, I had to think about it more, but I'm thinking about the other project, the other NGO that I worked with, which I called more, they were positing a form of cosmopolitan Buddhist ethics. And I say that because they were a local NGO that was really drawing on a lot of international aid, networks, diaspora, and they framed, when they were talking about what's Buddhist about the organization, they were actually very reticent to call it Buddhist, vis-a-vis saying we are not Sinhala Buddhist nationalists. And they were like, we work with all these aid workers, we have all these volunteers, we have all this kind of like kind of transnational, translocal kind of connections and development work, and we see ourselves as international and not national. Although their work was nationally bounded, so they're doing stuff within Sri Lanka. And he himself is Sinhalese Buddhist from like a Buddhist men's school. So he comes from the same culture that these women emerged from, but the way in which they framed themselves was like kind of anti-nationalist, in a sense, speaking the language of the international aid world. So it's an interesting kind of question you bring up, and I'm just kind of riffing on what you just said.
Yeah, no, that was very interesting. Thank you.
Absolutely. We've got a few minutes for more questions. My question was actually on the Cosmopolitan Buddhist ethics idea that I enjoyed your chapter from a book that I'm now forgetting what the book was called about that previously, and I think that was a very useful idea to bring up. But the contrast between these two organizations, the one you've spoken about today and that other organization, and the way that there's a real performative element of saying we are this transnational, and that means, as you've just been saying, that it's contrary to this nation building that might be looked down upon, and the politicized, you know, putting yourself as the international takes yourself away from the politicized context of or the complications that might be seen, or the reasons that the organization you've spoken about today might be looked down upon by the international humanitarian and development workers. So I thought the Cosmopolitan Buddhist ethics, the links to secular humanitarianism, is a great point. But also I do remember that you had some questions from Andrea left over if you wanted to answer any of those as well. So.
Yeah, I'll jump to that question about how do these women see themselves. Oh, actually, let me start with the one which is about the women in the communities and the villages. How do they see it? And it's absolutely a methodological limitation in which I didn't really get time to spend time at the spaces in which they would go, because I would join them in these like camps, medical camps, because they were doctors. And so I'd get on the bus, the military bus with them, and then we would fly in and fly out. And so talking to, you know, the community members on something very pretty sensitive, just like asking them, how do you think about this, was a little, I was also younger and a little like uncertain about how to like ask these kind of very blunt questions. So it's a limitation, methodological limitation, but absolutely important. And really kind of interesting to see how like the rhetoric of, you know, invoking their sons' patriotism, how did that impact their own kind of ideas of what was being said? You know, they were also coming to just get medical, like, you know, pharmaceutical drugs and get an easy drug prescription. And so were they just being kind of like, whatever you're saying, just lady, you know, I don't know, it could have been a lot of things. And then your other interesting question is about how do they see themselves as feminists? And I do think so. I do think so, that they do see themselves as feminists, but not in the way that we may consider themselves. One of the professors who was one of the founding organizations, she writes about the female renunciant order and how that is a feminist kind of move, and that it's an important kind of political, like more like political with a small p, but a political movement within the Buddhist establishment to enable kind of the bhikkhuni, like allow nuns to become full, renunciants to become, female renunciants to become full nuns. So you know, in their scholarship and kind of in their kind of prestige in society, I do think that they do see themselves as feminists, but maybe just not the definition of feminist that we would apply. And maybe they kind of move between it in and out of those definitions as well, which would be a really interesting kind of study, as well as how do these individuals in their over the course of their lifetime in the different projects that they do see their own feminism shift and change.
Okay, we are officially over time now. I realize other people may need to leave to go to other meetings or to go to sleep, Alana, I hope. But thank you very much for your time today, Nalika and Andrea. We're very appreciative of it. Just to remind everyone on the call as well that this will go up as a video on the JLI website. So if you missed the beginning and you'd like to go back and hear more at the beginning of Nalika's presentation, we'll be posting that in the next couple of days or so. And then just another final reminder that the next session will be on the new edited volume, Political Theologies and Development in Asia, Transcendence, Sacrifice and Aspiration. We'll be hearing from one of the editors and two of the chapter authors on that book. So it's a bit more of a book launch format where we'll have different presentations. And that is also at a different time. So please pay attention to the emails that you'll send out, that Rima will send out about the timings for that. But otherwise, thank you again to our presenter and responder, Nalika and Andrea, and thank you to everyone else for joining.
Thank you for having us, and thanks for everyone joining as well. I appreciate it, Andrea, as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.